On the desk in front of the old newspaperman, the envelopes are not white anymore. They have the color of old tea, the dry yellow of paper that has lived too long in folders, boxes, and evidence rooms. When he touches one corner, it gives off a small sound, not quite a crackle, not quite a whisper. More like a warning from another decade. The room is quiet except for the paper. A lamp bends over the desk. Outside the window, the city has grown taller and louder than it was in 1969. There are new bridges of light, new glass buildings, new phones that hold more information than an entire police file once could. But on the desk, the past has not changed. Ink remains ink, a stamp remains a stamp, a cipher remains a locked door. Old newspaperman has read the name many times. Zodiac. It is a short name, cold, easy to print in a headline, easy to remember. Too easy, perhaps. That was part of the damage. A killer chose a name, and newspapers carried it across breakfast tables, bus seats, police desks, and living rooms. Before long, the name became larger than the crimes, larger than the counties, larger than the frightened people who had to keep living in Northern California, while the letters kept coming. But the old reporter does not begin with a name. He begins with a paper. Because before the legend had a face, it never truly earned. Before the ciphers and the strange symbol, before detectives stared at handwriting until the loops and slants seemed to move on their own, there was only a dark road near Benicia, 2 teenagers, and a question that would not stay local. December 20, 1968. Lake Herman Road was the kind of place that looks harmless in daylight, a rural stretch, open fields, passing headlights, the thin quiet that gathers outside a small city after families have turned off their porch lights. Young couples knew roads like that. Parents knew them too, or thought they did. A place to talk, a place to sit in a parked car and believe the world beyond the windshield could wait. David Faraday was 17. Betty Lou Jensen was 16. They had the kind of youth that later becomes painful to list, because every detail points forward to a life that should have widened. School, friends, family, plans for tomorrow. A first date by many accounts, a simple winter night. By morning, their names had entered police reports. The first officers and investigators did not know they were standing at the edge of a case that would still be discussed more than half a century later. They did not know that newspapers would one day print strange symbols connected to this road. They did not know that amateur codebreakers, retired detectives, authors, filmmakers, and online researchers would return again and again to the place where the story began. They had a scene. They had 2 dead teenagers. They had a road that had gone quiet again, and they had no answer. For months, the case stayed where many unsolved cases stay, close to the families, close to the town, heavy in the files, but not yet a national shadow. People wondered whether the killer knew the victims, whether someone had seen a car, whether a stranger had chosen the place by chance. Leads moved through the ordinary channels of 1960s police work: interviews, tips, vehicle descriptions, paper records, telephone calls, handwriting in notebooks, typed pages, men knocking on doors. There were no cell phone towers to consult, no dashboard cameras, no neighborhood doorbell footage, no DNA database waiting in the background. The road did not remember license plates. The darkness did not give statements. The old newspaperman lifts one of the later letters and turns it under the lamp. The strange thing about paper is how ordinary it is. Anyone can buy it. Anyone can write on it. Anyone can fold it. And yet, in this case, paper became a weapon of another kind. Not the thing that killed, but the thing that carried fear afterward. It did not start that way. It started again with another parked car. July 4, 1969, became July 5 in Vallejo. Fireworks had marked the holiday earlier. But after midnight the noise faded, and Blue Rock Springs Park settled into the kind of darkness that makes a car interior feel both private and exposed. Darlene Ferrin was 22, a young mother and a waitress. Michael Mageau was 19. They were in Darlene's car when another vehicle appeared. The night narrowed. A man approached. Light, movement, confusion. The attack came fast. Darlene did not survive. Michael did. That single fact changed everything. A survivor means breath where the killer expected silence. It means a voice that can describe pieces of a moment no one else saw. But survival is not a clean window. It is shattered glass. Fear, injury, darkness, speed, and shock all pass through memory before words can form. What Michael Mageau could give investigators mattered deeply. It also had to be handled with care, because no witness under such pressure is a camera. Not long after the attack, a man called police from a payphone. In a modern case, a call might leave a trail of towers, logs, cameras, payment records, movement. In 1969, a payphone could become a doorway that closed almost as soon as it opened. The voice claimed responsibility for Blue Rock Springs. It also claimed the Lake Herman Road killings. That was the moment the air around the old case changed. Two crimes, months apart, now seemed to lean toward each other. The first road and the second park were no longer just places on a map. They became points in a pattern. A killer had not only returned, he had reached for credit. Still, the wider public did not yet understand what was coming. The old reporter slides the first newspaper letter closer to the lamp. Not the original, of course. The originals belong to archives, police files, and locked rooms. But copies can still trouble the hand. The symbols sit in rows, strange and childish and deliberate, as if someone had built a fence out of nonsense and dared the world to climb over it. At the end of July 1969, 3 newspapers received letters: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained a portion of a cipher. Each letter claimed responsibility. The writer wanted publication. He wanted the public to see the code. Editors now had a problem that did not belong only to journalism. If they printed the letters, they might be feeding the writer's appetite. If they refused, they had to live with the possibility that a threat ignored might become a headline no one could bear. Police needed the letters studied. Readers wanted to know whether their towns were safe. And somewhere beyond the newsroom, the writer waited to see if his paper trap had worked. The old newspapermen can almost hear that room. The ring of telephones, the low voices near an editor's desk, cigarette smoke flattening under the lights, a proof sheet marked in pencil, someone asking whether the code should run in the paper, someone else asking what happens if it does not. It is easy, decades later, to talk as if every decision should have been obvious. But in a newsroom, decisions arrive before certainty does. The letters were ugly, threatening, theatrical, and possibly useful. They might contain handwriting clues, fingerprints, a phrase, a mistake. They might also be exactly what the writer wanted, a stage. The cipher went into the world, and the public did what the public often does when terror arrives in the form of a puzzle. People tried to solve it. A code changes the way fear feels. It offers rules, it gives the mind something to hold. If the message can be read, perhaps the man can be found. If the symbols can be broken, perhaps the pattern will give up its center. At kitchen tables and in living rooms, ordinary people could look at the cipher and feel for a moment that they were not helpless. The first major cipher, the 408-character message, was solved quickly by a schoolteacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Harden. But when the door opened, the killer's name was not behind it. There was only a message that revealed appetite, not identity, a voice trying to make itself larger than the bodies it had left behind. A confession of sorts, but not the confession police needed. It was as if the writer had invited the public into a dark room and then removed the lamp. Soon afterward, another letter arrived with the sentence that would harden into history. "This is the Zodiac speaking." The old reporter pauses over that line, not because it deserves reverence, but because of what it did. A nameless killer is terrifying in one way. A self-named killer is terrifying in another. A name gives newspapers a handle. It gives the public something to repeat. It turns a police problem into a symbol. The man behind the letters understood that, or stumbled into it with cruel instinct. From that point on, the case had two tracks. There were the crimes, which belonged to roads, parks, victims, witnesses, detectives, and families. And there was the performance, which belonged to ink, symbols, deadlines, and fear. The two tracks crossed often, but they were not the same. By late summer, the Bay Area was listening differently. A strange car on a quiet road no longer seemed merely strange. A payphone could feel sinister. The morning newspaper could bring not only baseball scores and politics, but another message from a man who had learned how to enter the home without opening a door. Then the case moved north toward water and sunlight. Lake Berryessa, September 27, 1969. The old newspaperman always slows down at this page, not because the details need embellishment, but because the setting itself does the work. Daylight, a lake, a young couple away from the noise. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were students connected to Pacific Union College. They had gone to a place that should have been ordinary in a different way from the parked cars at night. Not a dark road, not midnight. Open air, water, late September light. That is what makes the scene so unsettling. The danger did not wait for darkness. A man approached wearing an unusual hooded costume marked with a symbol. The image has become one of the most remembered pieces of the case, perhaps because it seems almost too theatrical to belong to real life. But Brian Hartnell survived, and the disguise mattered. It meant the attacker could speak and still hide. He could stand near them and remain a shape. He could turn himself into a sign, for the newspapers had even finished turning him into a name. He spoke with them. He gave a story. He controlled the encounter for a time. Then the calm broke. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later. Brian Hartnell lived. The car door became a page. On it, the attacker left dates and locations, linking the moment at Lake Berryessa to what had come before. This was not only violence. It was authorship. He was writing himself into the scene, marking it as part of his series, making sure that investigators and journalists would not file it away as something separate. Then came another call from a payphone in Napa. Again the voice, again the report, again the feeling that the man had stepped close enough to leave a trace and far enough to vanish. In San Francisco, Inspector Dave Toschi would become one of the names tied most closely to the Zodiac investigation. By then, Toschi was already known as a distinctive detective. Sharp clothes, sharp eye, a man whose public image would later become almost as famous as some of the files he worked. But the real weight of a case is not in the way a detective looks walking down a hallway. It is in the paperwork after midnight, the witness statement that does not quite settle, the phone tip that sounds promising until it dissolves, the envelope opened with care because the smallest trace might matter. Imagine Toschi's desk not as movie scenery, but as a working surface slowly being swallowed by uncertainty. Reports from different jurisdictions: Benicia, Vallejo, Napa County, San Francisco. Handwriting comparisons, maps, sketches, photographs, notes about calls, questions about which letters were real and which might be imitations. A detective could follow one thread until it touched another, only to find the knot tightening instead of loosening. The Zodiac case punished certainty. A clue could be important, or it could be performance. A letter could prove contact, or it could mislead. A misspelling could reveal something, or nothing. A symbol could carry meaning, or merely pretend to. The writer seemed to understand that confusion had value. He did not need to be invisible all the time. He only needed to be unclear. Then, on October 11, 1969, the case entered San Francisco itself. Paul Stine was 29, a cab driver and a student. He picked up a passenger. The ride went to Presidio Heights, a neighborhood of quiet streets and expensive homes. The kind of place where violence feels as if it has taken a wrong turn simply by arriving. Stine was killed in his cab. At first, the crime could have looked like a robbery. Cab drivers face dangers that rarely make legends. They carry strangers. They stop where passengers tell them to stop. They work inside a small space where the back seat is always behind them. But a letter later arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle with a piece of Stine's shirt enclosed. That changed the meaning of the crime. The writer was not merely claiming from a distance. He had sent something that tied him to the cab. For investigators, this should have been the moment when the fog thinned. There were witnesses in the neighborhood. There was a description. A composite sketch followed. Police moved quickly through the area. Reports, and later confronts would circle around the early description broadcast to officers, and whether the man they sought was misunderstood in those first crucial minutes. The Zodiac later boasted about being near police, but his boasts were never safe ground. He lied when lies served the show. He told enough truth to keep the show alive. That night must have sat heavily in Toschi's room. A city scene, a dead cab driver, a shirt fragment, a sketch. A killer who had now moved from lovers' lanes to a San Francisco street. The case no longer gave the public even the comfort of a simple warning. It was not enough to avoid a rural turnout. It was not enough to avoid a park at night. A man doing his job in the city had become part of the pattern. The old newspaperman can hear the newsroom again. Not panic, as people imagine it. Not screaming. Newsrooms are often quietest when the worst stories come in. Men and women lower their voices. Typewriters continue. Editors ask for confirmation. Someone calls police. Someone calls again. A headline has to be written, but no headline can carry the whole weight. And then, the letters kept coming. After Paul Stine, the confirmed killings stopped. The paper trail did not. This is where the Zodiac story begins to feel less like a straight road and more like a house with too many rooms. Some communications are widely accepted. Others are disputed. Some claims were grandiose. Some threats were terrifying. Some lines seemed designed to send police into one direction, then another. The writer understood that a single envelope could reopen the fear. Parents worried when school buses were threatened in letters. Cab drivers had reason to glance longer at a fare. Couples changed habits. Newspaper readers studied phrasing. Amateur detectives appeared long before the internet gave them a gathering place. The Zodiac had forced the public into the investigation, not by asking for help, but by making everyone wonder whether the next clue had already been printed and missed. In one corner of this story stood the detectives. In another, the journalists. And in the space between them sat a moral difficulty no headline could solve. The police needed information from the letters. The papers needed to inform the public. The public needed warnings. But the writer needed attention. Every published word risked feeding him. Every withheld word risked hiding something that mattered. Paul Avery, one of the San Francisco Chronicle reporters associated with the case, became part of that atmosphere. The Zodiac story was not only something journalists covered from a safe distance, it reached toward them. It entered the newsroom, the mail, the front page, and the private nerves of people whose job was to keep reading. The old reporter at the desk knows that kind of fear. Not the fear of a dark road exactly. The newsroom version is different. It is the fear that an envelope will arrive and everyone will gather around it because no one can ignore it. The fear that the writer has once again turned murder into copy. The fear that the public needs to know, and that the public's knowing is part of the trap. The case became larger with every contradiction. The Zodiac seemed careful, but he left traces. He seemed theatrical, but the crimes were real. He seemed to crave attention, but he hid his face. He wrote like someone who wanted to be understood, and coded like someone who wanted to remain unreachable. He claimed more victims than investigators could confirm. He attached himself to crimes in ways that made the public ask whether he was revealing truth or inflating a legend. For detectives, that meant every new claim had to be weighed, not swallowed. A killer can confess falsely to build a myth. A hoaxer can imitate a killer to borrow fear. A genuine letter can contain lies. A false letter can sound convincing if the public already knows enough details. The farther the case moved from the confirmed attacks, the harder the edges became to see. And, while the letters multiplied, suspects began to gather around the empty center. Arthur Lee Allen became the most famous of them. His name would later appear in books, discussions, documentaries, and arguments that seemed never to end. He lived in the area. He drew suspicion for reasons that have been widely reported. Some details around him appeared interesting to investigators and writers. A surviving victim later made an identification involving him, though long-delayed identifications in traumatic cases carry their own difficulties. For a storyteller, Allen is tempting because a named suspect gives the audience a shape to hold. A man, a place, a biography, a set of coincidences. But the law did not close around him. Physical evidence did not publicly establish him as the Zodiac. Handwriting, fingerprints, and later forensic questions did not produce the final proof. He died in 1992 without an official resolution to the case. So his name remains in the room, but not in the center chair. Other names came too, some from researchers, some from family claims, some from private groups, some attached to cipher theories, old photographs, timelines, or memories. Gary Francis Post would receive attention decades later after an outside group claimed to have identified him. But law enforcement did not accept that as the closing of the case. The old file did not shut. This is the danger of an empty center. People cannot bear it for long. When a case has no official answer, the mind tries to build one from pieces. A similar height, a watch, a handwriting sample, a phrase, a location, a military background, a code interest, a rumor, a family story. Each piece can feel warm in the hand. But a handful of warm pieces is not a conviction. In Toschi's world, suspicion had to become evidence. Evidence had to survive pressure. Pressure had to become proof. And proof never arrived in the way the case needed. The old newspaperman opens another folder. This one is not from 1969, but from the future looking backward. The 340-character cipher. For decades it sat like a sealed room inside the story. People stared at it. Experts studied it. Amateurs copied it. Computers eventually attacked it. With methods the original detectives could not have imagined. The symbols waded through presidents, wars, new technologies, old detectives retiring, witnesses aging, suspects dying, and newspapers losing the power they once had. Then, in 2020, the 340 was solved by private citizens. A locked door opened after 51 years. For a moment, the old hope returned. Perhaps this was where the name had been hiding. Perhaps the killer, arrogant enough to taunt, careless enough to boast, had buried himself in the pattern without realizing it. Perhaps the symbols would finally stop being a maze and become a map. But the solution did not give the name. It gave another performance. Another voice from the past, still taunting, still centered on fear and death, still refusing the one thing investigators needed most. The old newspaperman reads the solved message in silence and feels the peculiar cruelty of the case. Even progress can disappoint. Even a breakthrough can leave the central door closed. A cipher can be solved and still not solve the crime. That is why the Zodiac case endures in a way many other unsolved cases do not. It is not only that the killer was never officially identified. It is that he left behind objects that seem to promise identification. Letters, codes, symbols, maps, claims, a torn piece of a shirt, a handwriting style, a sketch. These are the kinds of things that make people believe the answer must be nearby. The case feels unsolved, not because it is empty, but because it is crowded. Crowded with names that do not quite hold. Crowded with letters that may or may not speak truth. Crowded with places whose roads have changed, but whose names still carry weight. Crowded with arguments about whether he stopped, died, moved, was jailed for something else, or simply lost interest in the performance, once the performance no longer satisfied him. The old reporter looks again at the list of victims. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein, Michael Mageau, and Brian Hartnell, who lived. The list is short compared with the legend. That imbalance is part of what makes the case so uncomfortable. The name Zodiac became vast. The human lives at the foundation of the case can be spoken in a few seconds. Yet each life contained more than the story can hold. David and Betty were not the beginning of a myth when they drove out that night. Darlene Ferrin was not a symbol when she parked at Blue Rock Springs. Cecilia Shepard did not go to Lake Berryessa to become part of an American mystery. Paul Stein was not carrying a legend in his cab. Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell did not survive, so strangers could endlessly rearrange their memories into entertainment. Still, the mystery keeps pulling people back. A man calls from a payphone and vanishes. A newspaper receives a cipher. A detective studies handwriting under a lamp. A reporter opens an envelope and understands that the story has entered the room before the sender did. A cab turns onto a quiet San Francisco street. A sketch appears, and for a moment the public thinks a face may become a name. Then the name does not come. Years pass. The paper yellows. The ink stays dark. Some cases go cold because there is too little to hold. The Zodiac case went cold while leaving behind too much to stop holding. Every object seems to whisper that the answer is close. Every object fails to say it plainly. Near the end of the night, the old newspaperman gathers the envelopes back into order. The rustle of paper is softer now. The city outside has moved on in all the ways cities move on. New crimes, new headlines, new technologies promising cleaner answers. But inside the folder, 1969 remains unfinished. Dave Toschi is gone now. Paul Avery is gone. Many of the people who first answered phones, typed reports, and opened envelopes are gone. Some suspects are gone. The young victims never had the chance to grow old. The survivors carried forward what no file could fully contain. And the man who wrote the name Zodiac remains officially unnamed. Perhaps he was local, familiar with the roads and rhythms of the Bay Area. Perhaps he was less brilliant than the legend made him, protected by timing, confusion, and the limits of the era. Perhaps the letters were not an afterthought, but the center of what he wanted. The power to make strangers read him, fear him, and keep his chosen name alive. Perhaps one of the suspects was closer than the public can prove. Perhaps the truth sat for years in a file no one could quite connect to another file. None of those possibilities is enough by itself. The case has trained generations to confuse closeness with arrival. A theory can come near the door. It cannot open it without the key. The old reporter turns off the lamp. For a moment the room disappears except for the pale rectangles of paper on the desk. They look almost harmless. Envelopes, copies, symbols, old ink. But that is how this case entered the world after the crimes. Not with thunder, but with mail. A folded page, a demand for attention. A code that promised a hidden self and delivered only more darkness. The final sound is paper sliding back into a folder. Not an ending, a closing for tonight. Because somewhere inside the Zodiac case, there is still a blank space where a name should be. And around that blank space, all the old evidence continues to circle. The road near Benicia, the park in Vallejo, the lake in Napa County, the cab in Presidio Heights, the newsroom, the detective's desk, the cipher solved too late to save anyone, and not enough to name the man who wrote it. The legend wanted to be larger than the people, but paper remembers more than the name at the bottom of a letter. It remembers pressure marks, deadlines, fear, the hands that opened the envelopes, the detectives who stayed late, the families who waited, the survivors who kept breathing after the night should have ended them. And if the case is ever solved, if a name is finally placed where the blank space has been, the most important question will not be whether the legend was clever. It will be why it took so long for the paper to speak.